It's Borderline
with Ireti Bakare-Yusuf.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. We go everywhere, everywhere. There are no borders that we cannot cross. My name is Ireti Bakare-Yusuf. I have with me a friend of the house. I look forward to talking with him because he's unlike many sort of British people. He says it as it is. He's not embarrassed. I think that's the Irish in him, probably, I think. You know, because Irish people don't mess. They tell you and let you know exactly how they feel. His name is Professor Scott Douglas. He's the Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College, Dublin. Professor Emeritus of International Politics at the University of Birmingham and the Editor-in-Chief of EA Worldview. He's a specialist in American politics, US and British foreign policy and international affairs, including the Middle East and Iran, Europe and Asia. Prof. Scott, how are you?
I'm great because I get to be here with you and your fine listeners.
Oh, that's too sweet. That's too sweet. Lagos, Nigeria, wherever you're listening from, you heard that. I need my people to cut that and make sure we use it for a promo. And I didn't pay him, I promise. I can't afford him. Look, the last time you were here, we were talking about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc. So much has happened. Since then, we've got a new president in America. We've got Trump, and it's the world. Some would say everything has gone upside down. I actually say we now have there's a dystopian world and there's a Trumpian dystopia. Right? We're now in a Trumpian dystopia, and so many things are happening at once. I could keep you here for 4 hours, and I think we would never kind of complete it. But first of all, let's talk about. I've just finished talking to a professor of Russia and Russia studies at Harvard and Eurasia studies at Harvard, Mikhail Strovsky. The center to everything that's going on now is the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that America, who is normally the negotiator, the mediator, well, supposedly, right, is now actually, if you like, the divider, the one that's taking sides under President Trump. And it doesn't matter which side you're on. President Trump came in and he promised the world, he promised America, I will end this war. What did he say? Within 4 days or whatever of him getting in. We're now some 5 weeks or so into his presidency, and we still have this chaos. We've got Ukraine on one side, we've got Russia on one side. He hasn't been able to get anybody to get any of them together. They're going to Saudi Arabia. They're talking in Saudi Arabia. Ukraine, Zelensky is not there. He's not interested in going. It's chaos. It's just chaos. Throw your toys out of the pram, kind of chaos. Talk to us about this moment.
Yeah, an important moment for all of us.
Yeah.
It doesn't, not just Russia, Ukraine, but you mentioned Israel. Gaza's going on. We've got developments in the Middle East. We've got big developments in Africa that'll be affected by what Trump does. Mm-hmm. And here's my starting point before we get to the specific issue. Quite often, Donald Trump thrives on chaos. Mm-hmm. He thrives on keeping people uncertain, keeping them scared. He thrives on being a bully, to be honest with you. So how do you get back power in that situation? You have to walk it back to what is actually happening and, cast an eye on it. Not to be pro or anti-Trump, pro or anti-US, but to say, here's where we are. The starting point for all this is that it is now, I think, the 21st of February. In 3 days' time, it will be the third anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Wow.
Which you should never forget. It was not NATO that invaded Ukraine. It was not the US that invaded Ukraine. It was Vladimir Putin who decided he wanted to conquer a neighboring country. And you're talking about since then that many hundreds of thousands of troops have been killed, but many thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed. Many tens of thousands have been deported, including more than 20,000 children. Yeah, I could go on and on about the toll of this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What happens is that Russia really is not succeeding in conquering Ukraine. They're taking a bit of territory in eastern Ukraine, but they're having to expend a lot of troops, right? They've been going for 3 years. Ukraine is still holding out. They have an economy that's going to be, I think it's going to reach a pretty important point in 2025, whether they can keep sustaining the war. They're under international sanctions. So where's Putin's hope? Putin's hope was Trump getting into office in the US. Now, I've got to emphasize here, no conspiracy here. It wasn't like Russia arranged for Trump to get in. He did win that election, and you have to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And
because genocide has consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's an extremely good point, that we're not just here to keep bashing Trump, that U.S. foreign policy has got a lot to answer for. But we are where we are now with the fact is that Donald Trump is beholden to Russia for many years. He was beholden to Russia as a businessman. But as a politician, they helped his 2016 campaign. I mean, there's a lot of disinformation. Oh, it's all made up. It's Russiagate. Russia was involved in providing stolen information, including emails. They were involved in providing disinformation, and the Trump people knew about it. Trump knew about it. And Trump admires Vladimir Putin because Putin is a strong leader, a tough leader. He's an autocrat. And if we were to talk about what's happening within the U.S., Trump wants to be an autocrat. Anyway, cut of this is, all right, how's Russia going to play Trump here? And they're going to play to Trump's ego, which is Trump says, there was never a war when I was president, which is not true, but we'll park that for a moment. He says, if I get into office, I'm going to solve the war within 24 hours. Okay, Russia hears that. Okay, we'll wait a few weeks. Then we'll invite the Americans to talk directly to us, but without the Ukrainians, without the Europeans who have been supporting Ukraine, just us versus the U.S., right? And they do that in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday. And everybody might say that. I know that Trump said, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with making a deal with Russia? You know, it's good to try to get an end to the Russian invasion, right? Because Russia sets the terms of those talks. When Russia brought the Americans in on Tuesday, they said, for example, look, we occupy about 25% of Ukraine. We would like you to recognize that. We don't want you to keep saying that Ukraine sovereignty, Ukraine territory, all for Ukraine. We want you to recognize the territory we hold. And indeed, they want the U.S. to allow them to take more territory. Okay. Secondly, what they say is, we want you to lift the sanctions on us, lift those restrictions on us. And then thirdly, they say, we don't want any security guarantees for Ukraine. We don't want Ukraine to have a strong military backed by the West because it gives them a free hand to attack later if they want to. And the American delegation goes back and Donald Trump says, Russia, that's great. They've negotiated with us, right? They're trying to find an end to this war. And at the same time, he trashes Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukraine president, calling him a dictator, lying that he only has 4% support. And again, we always have to go to facts. The latest Ukraine poll shows that Vladimir Zelensky has about 57 to 58% support. Donald Trump has, latest US polls, 48% support. So it's not that Zelensky is a dictator. It's not that he is holding out against elections. It's that Ukraine cannot have elections while it's under attack. That's its constitution. But what you get is that every time you get noises from some American administrators, oh, we'll talk to Ukraine, we'll do this, Trump goes onto social media and he bashes Zelensky. And let me give you a stinger to this that your listeners may not know. The reason why Trump is really upset with Zelensky is what Trump wanted out of Zelensky is, he's a businessman, right? Trump. He always thinks, I'm going to get something off of other people. It's a win-lose thing. He's done it with African countries as well. He says, Ukraine has these rare earth minerals. They've got lithium, they've got manganese, right? They've got titanium. I want $500 billion of rare earth minerals in return for what the U.S. gave Ukraine in the past, not for future aid. I want them to hand that over. His Treasury Secretary went to Ukraine last week, presented a draft agreement that was very hastily made up, told Zelensky, sign it. Zelensky said, no, we're going to study it. And then Zelensky said, it's not ready yet. It does not conform. It only conforms to U.S. law, not Ukraine law. And we don't get enough compensation. And when Trump heard that, that's when he went ballistic. That is, you can actually time it when he heard it. And so, Trump has this idea that Putin is someone he admires who will work with him, whereas Zelensky will rip him off. And that means that even though, as you said in your news headlines, there was a U.S. envoy that Zelensky met yesterday, it was sort of like a consolation prize for not being at the table with the Russians. The U.S. envoy, who is one of the best of the Trump people, Keith Kellogg, said, yes, this is an embattled and honorable leader and a talented national security team. But how long before those words will be undone by something that Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr., who just yesterday said Vladimir Zelensky is a CIA plant for regime change in Ukraine, right? How long before they undo that? And once again, they're just parroting the Kremlin's propaganda lines.
Let's talk about the change in it's just such an incredibly interesting times, especially for us journalists and for you professors, because it's Trump is the content provider that just doesn't stop giving, right? Every single turn, he just keeps giving us content. We're at this space where, power is shifting, and there's a quote that I found, and I thought I liked it very much. I thought I'd share it with you and our listeners. Empires implode from within due to their own excesses. Is that where United States has gotten to?
Let's break that down. And then let me say two things.
Go ahead.
Which is going to sound a bit strange, given me that you've got me on here to talk about Trump. The first is...
Well, we can talk everything. You're here to talk everything.
Well, and watch how I'm going to do this. First, I wish we didn't live in such interesting times. I mean, I would be so happy if it was boring. I mean, I wake up every morning and wish that I didn't have to get onto my website and cover some bit of craziness. Secondly, I now have a policy that when I write stories for EA Worldview or when I do interviews with other outlets, if I can, I don't lead with what Trump said, because I don't want Trump to have the news cycle. I'm actually listening to your news headlines, and I'm actually interested in Nigerian politics, right? So it's like that's where I would want my lead to be.
Right.
So my lead here is going to actually be about America, and in terms of where we are. And again, I'm going to sound something that's going to say really strange. I have never been one who really liked the idea of America as a superpower, even though at the start of this century, America, which had historically said we are not an empire, there were all these commentators saying we're now the superpower, it's the unipolar era. I never liked that because there's always other countries who have interest, who do have some form of their power. They aren't just simply puppets. So it's not just like America pulling the strings. But if you really want to go down that line of when America started to really undo itself, it was in 2003. I mean, it was the invasion of Iraq, because they failed. I mean, they flat out failed. Saddam Hussein fell, that's fine. But Iraq fell apart. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. About 5,000, I think just under 5,000 American troops, if you want to add that in. But it really showed the limits of American power, as did Afghanistan, which goes for 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. And then what you had was you had the economic shocks. You had the Great Recession that affected a lot of us, but including in the United States. You had Trump coming in on the back of the Great Recession, playing the snake oil salesman. Then we had COVID. So the idea of America as this colossus bestriding the earth, which I never completely bought into, even if they were the leading military power, the leading economic power, it gets exposed. And when it gets exposed, everybody swings the other way and says, oh, it's a multipolar world, or it's a world which is going to be dominated by BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And by the way, people who think BRICS is going to dominate the world, here's a news flash for you. India and China don't get along. Okay, I just want to say that. Every time I do work with Indian media, it's like, are we going to be attacked by China? It's like, well, okay. And South Africa doesn't necessarily get along with everybody in that group either.
Absolutely. We're going to unpack BRICS because Trump has already pulled India out of BRICS pretty much. Yes.
It is. So where am I getting to with all of this? What I'm getting to here is that what you've got a kaleidoscope of power that takes place, right? Now, that means the U.S. still has influence. It's still, as we have mentioned, very influential because it backs Israel over Gaza, and that has had deadly consequences. It's influential in Africa. as are the Chinese, as the Russians are in some parts of the continent, without denying African countries their power, that's fine. But what we're at a moment, and which gets to your question is the empire implodes within is, yeah, I think, I'm going to turn it to something which is very personal to me. I'm worried that the American system is imploding. But it's not imploding the way that we thought it would. It's not imploding the way that we thought it would, which is American overreach. They'll be out of resources. The military will be overextended. America's still one of the richest countries. America's going to implode within because they lost a decent and respectful political culture. And we can talk about how social media is part of that, new media is part of that. But what happened here is that America, rather than having that type of dialogue and discussion that you need to keep a country moving forward, it turned it into a battle of us versus them. And Donald Trump has exploited it. And he's now at the point where he and his unelected co-president, Elon Musk, are trying to tear the system apart.
That very short phrase, America has lost the decent political, what is it say? Structure, I think is what you say.
Political culture. Political culture. The way we talk to each other. Yeah.
Yes. That's so important on many levels. And, we could spend a couple of minutes actually unpacking that. You mentioned American foreign policy. And some would actually argue that the foreign policy, as the more it became aggressive and imperialist and domineering and invasive, the more, the more they lost their decency. Would that be a correct statement?
I think there's an interesting exception to that. And hear me out on this, right? First of all, in saying this is not true of every case during the Obama years, right? And again, Israel-Palestine is always going to be
we're still going to talk about that. Yes,
distinct case.
Yeah.
But let's talk about when Obama came in. What Obama tried to do was he tried to undo the mistakes and the mess they got themselves into over Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Now, he didn't do it completely. He still kept American troops in Iraq to an extent. And of course, he didn't. I think he made the mistake of not coming out of Afghanistan at that point. He kept maintaining them in Afghanistan. But what happened in some ways is that America didn't exercise, and I'm going to use the word power now in a positive sense, when it could have. And there were interesting cases. I think, and we could have a big discussion on this, different part of Africa, but it's interesting. I do think that when you talk about the so-called Arab Spring, that the United States had as Hillary Clinton put it, to be on the right side of history, which is stop propping up Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, stop propping up the Ben Ali regime, Ben Aziz regime in Tunisia, and of course, deal with the threat to Libyan people from Gaddafi, right? Now, what happened here is that when it got difficult, when those people fell, is that the U.S. didn't live up to the mark, not by coming in and trying to dominate the countries, but in a sense, they stepped aside, right? They stepped aside when Libya, and Libya's still better off, I would argue, than when under Gaddafi, but we can debate that later on. But when the militias are going after each other, they stepped aside on Syria. They did not intervene to protect Syrian civilians because they were worried they would be accused of being imperialist if they came in. And that was a huge mistake. Here I am talking to you now, more than 13 and now going on almost 14 years after that Syrian rising, and the Assad regime is gone.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a story to be told here, which is it's not angels or devils. What happened is that the anti-Assad forces, who had been maintained by Turkey, which has a very mixed foreign policy, those guys have come into power, and you have a very different Syria than you do under Assad. But I'm taking this all the way back around to tell you that I think the Obama people were sometimes too cautious in terms of what they were doing. I think they were sometimes too cautious in terms of dealing with certain African issues. I think, for example, and here I'm going to go beyond the idea of just simply militaries and so on. If you talk about the health issues in Africa, if you talk about the economic issues in Africa, if you talk about the social issues in Africa, I think the Obama people could have been more involved in Africa, but not trying to dominate Africa, but saying to Africans, what do you want? How can we help?
Well,
right?
President Obama is the African that actually didn't put Africa first. That's the.
That's and that's right. And again, I would put it to you that it is weird. But if you get into it, because of that damage from Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of the Obama people, I know some of them, it was like the idea of, well, if we go in and do this, people are going to think we're being imperialist and dominant, right? And that it's like, well, no, look, you can intervene in cooperation with a country.
Yeah,
you're not always intervening against it. And I just think I have respect for Obama on many fronts, but on this area of America abroad, I think he was indecisive, and I think he did not follow through on the promise that we would have hoped for.
Gosh, Scott, we need more time. We need more time to really unpack this. So here we are under President Trump. So here's the first thing I want to say is that you said something really interesting. There are many who were looking forward to the American implosion, which is America losing their power over the world. But like you rightly said, it's interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that. It's not happening the way we thought or we would have preferred it to happen. However, it is happening though. So is Trump that weapon that is fashioned against America and indeed the imperialist West?
Yeah. Oh, he is. He is a weapon against the United States from within. But let me take this in two stages. The first is, it's we don't have to go into conspiracy theories in terms of this, that Trump doesn't think of himself as a weapon against the United States. Trump thinks of himself as in what's good for Donald Trump, right? And so the starting point for Trump is he runs the government as he would his business, which is for his ego. And we could talk about that. And so we're at the point now where he and Elon Musk, who also has a very big ego, who also sees no role for government except to help his businesses, they're going in and stealing the data of millions of Americans. They are firing thousands of staff. They are dismantling entire agencies, lying about those agencies. And I would talk about the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Oh, yes, we're going to talk USAID because that's actually been a subject. You're very interested in Nigeria in our National Assembly this week.
Yeah, exactly. And so, they're also trying to dismantle Department of Education. They're trying to undermine security agencies like the FBI. And the fact here is that, it's never an anti or pro-government thing. It's the fact is that when you have a large country, you do need government there. You don't have government, you wind up having anarchy, or you have autocracy, which is what Trump is aiming for. The Russians are using him as a weapon. They are using him as a weapon. They've done that for years. I'm not going to say that they designed it like this, but it gave the Russians an opportunity. What I would say here is, and this is the point which gets us back to Nigeria, to Africa, it is not enough to say that America might implode or that the system might be damaged. Because all of us, I think it's incumbent, is like, what do we do about our countries and about our regions, right? It's like when you sit and you watch the largest house in the village burn down, you don't just sit there and stare at it and you don't clap. You actually go back and look at your house.
But here's the thing.
Sure it's not going to get consumed by the fire.
Let me put this to you, though. Here's the thing.
Yeah.
A lot of us Africans, certainly those of us who are, very involved in this whole geopolitical shape, etc., would say, it's Trump, it's America. It doesn't matter. Let them take their money away. It's time for Africa to wake up and stand on their own 2 feet. It's time for African leaders to actually do what they voted in for. It's because we've always had a strong, if you like, Africa, money giving, aid giving America, that our leaders continue to be lazy and ineffective. So really, if America implodes, it shouldn't bother us. We learn to stand up instead of crawling, which has been going on for too long. And then we can choose who our friends should be.
I actually agree with that, but there's going to be a bit of responsibility that comes after it. I fully agree. I actually, when I became a professor 26 years ago, God, I feel old. And you have to give an inaugural lecture, and all the university administration come out. And it's like, what are you going to talk about? I was like, well, I'm going to tell them that the United Kingdom should stop following the United States. The UK should stand on its own 2 feet and stop following America. And at that, I'm looking at the vice chancellor's face, and he's gone pale, right? Because this is not what he wanted, the professor of American studies to be saying. In a sense, here we are at 26 trillion, and you're absolutely right. African countries should look first and foremost, which is we have to build up our economies, we have to build up our societies, and we need responsible leaders to do that. And because if you don't get societies or economies built up, it's like a diversion, an excuse to say, oh, we'll blame America. We'll blame America for it going wrong. But here's where the responsibility comes in. 73% of the global power of companies is still in the United States.
Right.
That's according to the Morgan Stanley Index, right? So if America implodes, there are going to be economic shocks, and it's going to affect everybody. So you have to prepare yourself as a society to realize that you have got to deal with the fact you're not going to be immune from America falling apart. So it redoubles the fact that you need responsible leadership.
Absolutely. Because the one thing African leaders have not done is to prepare for anything at all. They've not prepared the country, the continent, any of the countries to stand by their own, independent of Western interference. And of course, we all know, it is clear. I mean, Trump was coming. We can go now talk, which it actually takes us to Europe. So EU, you saw Trump coming. Literally, you had dealt with him in Trump 1.0, and all of a sudden, he still finds you. He had won the election. You still weren't prepared. You didn't prepare yourself for his inauguration and post-inauguration. And here you are, you're scrambling around, trying to figure out how to fight this monster, if you like, who is basically standing in front of you and saying, tough, I'm going to do what I want. You don't have to like it. If this marriage breaks up, doesn't matter.
I'm going to give your listeners a scoop.
Tell us.
The EU, and the EU is flawed. European Union is flawed.
Oh, totally.
But the EU has been preparing for this for years.
What, this moment to be free?
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh,
absolutely.
tell us.
What happened? And I can tell you this from people I know, and people I know who are in Brussels at the EU, people I know who are in national governments. They had realized that even, that Trump was going to run again in 2024. They knew that. Several months ago, when it became evident that Joe Biden was in a state of decline, even before that was publicly finally acknowledged, they were planning for the fact there might be a Trump presidency. And they were doing two things. One is they were going to try to make the move to flatter Trump, right? Now, here I think you can criticize the EU, which is they're finding out. And I think they actually realized it last week at something called the Munich Security Conference, when two of Trump's people, the defense secretary and the vice president, trashed Europe. I think they realized that's not going to work. But the other thing that they were doing is they were beginning to organize their economic, their military efforts, their security efforts, where they have to be able to do it without the U.S. being in the lead. They did realize that. Here was the problem that the EU faced. First of all, remember the EU is not a military organization.
Right.
The EU is a political and an economic organization.
Yes, of course.
So what you had to do is that you had to talk, and you had to go through NATO, right? Now, NATO is not officially involved in the defense of Ukraine. It's not inside the country. So each of those national governments had to work through NATO to say, what is France doing? What's Britain doing? What's Germany doing? And to try to coordinate it. Let me give you a statistic. The largest European military is Germany. Germany has a defense budget of around about $85 billion. The U.S. defense budget is more than $900 billion. So the problem here is not planning. The problem here is that the U.S. has so much more resource than the Europeans do. On the economic, and then again, you could talk about that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, for example. You can talk about that there has been a bolstering of NATO's military committee. And then the EU itself has been as important, arguably more important than the US in providing economic and financial aid to Ukraine. what they are facing now is they may have to do it without the U.S.
And that's the question. Can they?
That's unprecedented.
Can they?
We're going to see, and it's going to be interesting. I think, first of all, it's not a question of everything collapses immediately because the Russians have their own problems. And I think it's important that the Europeans do what they can in the idea of you simply try to hold the line against Russia conquering Ukraine, right? But I think it's also important that the Europeans reach out beyond the US, and they reach out, for example, to countries in Africa to give an explanation of what is going on here. Because for Africans, I can imagine this just looks like a conflict between former colonial countries, right? You know, France and, you know, there's the Germans and all that. And then there's the Russians on the other side. And I think the EU has to reach out and say, look, we're talking about global security here. We are talking about global security. So, for example, Ukraine falls to the Russians. It has a major effect on grain exports, right? As it did in the starting point for this invasion. Yeah. So, you know, everybody's got to. The EU has to do that with respect.
Let me ask you, should we? So, here's the question. Two questions, rather, if you like. First and foremost, why does the West hate Putin or Russia so much? What is it? Because here's the thing. And why should we Africans be afraid of Putin, of Russia? Russia's never actually invaded our country. It's never invaded our continent. So why should we? Why should we be afraid of them? If they take Ukraine, and as long as they can give us wheat, why should we care?
Okay, so let me tell you a story.
Go on.
In terms of it. First of all, facts matter, right? And the narrative that is there, not just in Africa, it's around the world. It's here in Ireland. It's in the U.S. Is, it was NATO that started this war over Ukraine. Well, that's absolute. If you believe that, I'll sell you some property down on the coast where I live. Okay? 20 years ago in 2004, Vladimir Putin, who had come into Russia a few years, began making plans to effectively try to expand Russian power, right? He felt like Russia had been humiliated because it lost the Cold War. And we can discuss the Cold War. I'm not a huge fan of American foreign policy in the Cold War. We can discuss that. But Putin felt it. What Putin then began to do is Putin began trying to destabilize countries. Now, they weren't African countries at this point. But by 2007, he was conducting cyber warfare to try to break Estonia, one of the Baltic states. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. In 2008, he attacked Georgia on the borders, which takes place, right? By 2010, he's trying to undermine governments throughout Eastern Europe using what we call hybrid warfare. And of course, in 2014, when the people of Ukraine pushed back, and it was the people of Ukraine, it wasn't NATO, it wasn't the US, people of Ukraine say, we want political rights. We want to be free from repression. And the pro-Russian leader flees. Putin strikes back, seizes part of Ukraine, Crimea, starts to try to split the east of Ukraine off. And that's the story before you get to 2022, right? But he's also done more. Russia's massive disinformation campaign, which intervenes in elections around the world, not just the US elections, German elections, French elections, elections in Scotland, in Brexit, right? And now I'm getting to your place in Africa. You're not aside from all of this, because what Russia does is we want to expand our economic power and we want to push back against the Americans. Africa has got a lot of resources. So what are we going to do? Let's go into sub-Saharan Africa. Let's go into places like Mali. Let's go in and support coups in those countries. Let's send in Russian paramilitaries, the best known of them being the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group are going to take resources out of those countries at a discounted rate and take them back to Russia. And Wagner's caused a hell of a lot of instability. And I'm not saying, by the way, that the Americans are blameless for what they've done in the past, or not blameless for what the Europeans. You talk about Mali, you can talk about the French in the past. I'm just saying, eyes open on what the Russians are doing. Right. The Russians are not there being the victim of others, and they are not leaving Africa alone in terms of what they're doing. I mean, the other power that's involved here, if we were really going to get into this, is the Chinese. Absolutely, right? The Chinese, yes. Hold on, Scott. Let me just remind my people they can call 0201 465 7190
or send a message to 0809 597 5805. Yes, let's talk the Chinese. So the Chinese have a reputation of, we just want business. We just want an economy. We don't want to war with anybody. But, we'll spread ourselves all over your country. Just do business with us. We have different types. Pick the one you want. Whichever one you pick is what we'll do for you. If you like an envelope, we'll give you an envelope. If you don't do envelopes, we won't do brown envelopes. They have that reputation of literally shaping into whatever situation they find themselves, and they're quite happy for it to happen. So, again, this change in hegemony, which is military, economical, politics, and the Chinese, where the Chinese is concerned, is very much economy, right? And what should Africa be worried about? Because Africa's had enough of the Americans. Quite clearly, we've had enough, right? The Chinese have been coming in for the last 20, 30 years, and now they're really proper here. And again, we're like, okay. I have a friend who often his favorite, the way he puts it properly is, I'd rather speak English than Mandarin. That's what he says all the time, So yeah, we Africans. Are we swapping one for another?
This is precisely why, and it happens a lot in the discourse, that everybody starts from the standpoint is it the U.S. who is good or bad? Is it the Russians who are good or bad? Is it the Chinese who are good or bad? They play it out like an hour-long program on TV, and that's the wrong way to look at it. You start from the point of what's in the interest of
Africa,
of Nigeria, for example.
Absolutely, Nigeria.
Africa. And then you with eyes open talk about those countries as they come in there. Now, and again, I'd love to discuss this with your listeners at a point we could talk for, but quite often the Chinese have the advantage of when they come in, they're not coming in with their military. At least you don't see the military, right?
No.
Now, there is some Chinese military involved, but that it's more at the level of technology and so on, right?
Yeah.
Chinese come in, and the whole story story that you always tell us, the Chinese come in and say, all right, where do you want your football stadium?
Yeah.
Right? Because where do you want your football stadium, right? And it's like they come in and they build all these projects, right? And do that. Now, the thing here is you don't get something for nothing, right? So the Chinese are going to want to get something out of the fact that they're putting this into your country. And it really comes down to the question of not when things get constructed, it's when the question of when they get operated, right? So the infrastructure is put in. So who gets the profits off of the infrastructure that's running?
Yeah.
Who bears the cost of maintaining the infrastructure, right? If the infrastructure causes consequences, let's say environmental damage, who has to bear the cost of that? That's when it gets really tricky.
Right.
The first phase, which is really easy, is the first phase of development, is just putting it in initially. And then making it work and to keep working. And that's been the story of Africa for a long time.
A long time.
The British invested a lot, but
too long.
But okay, so that's where you are with the Chinese. But the reality is the Chinese are trying to create an alternative economic system. I mean, that's what they're trying to do, right, to the West. Now they have certain disadvantages. And your friend is quite right. One of their disadvantages is language, because English has become pretty much the global language.
Yeah.
So the other problem they have is that their currency, the RMB, is still not an internationally convertible currency. It's still the dollar that still rules as the currency. But beyond all of that, what I would say is this, that at least in the short term, what I would be playing this out as is Russia is not coming out well out of putting so much resource into trying to conquer Ukraine, even if they get a little bit of it. The Americans are not going to come out of well in terms of what Trump has done, right? So and let me tell you two quick things that happened in the past week.
Yeah.
That were...
I'll go to the lines because they're already calling. Yeah. Go on. Let me let you
very quickly. First thing, when Trump came out with his statement about ethnic cleansing of Gaza, right? That you just move the Palestinians, the Gazans into another country. Why do they need to be in their homeland? The Chinese immediately went to Arab countries and signaled, we would like to talk to you about the reconstruction of Gaza.
And Scott, that's exactly, as an expert on that whole conflict. That is I didn't even know this. I said this on all the groups that I was discussing this with. And they said, nobody's able to do this, only America. I said the Chinese. If you get the Chinese in, they will be able to build it for you. At the very least, start immediately, you will begin to see the change. In 5 years, you won't recognize it anymore. Because that's what we know.
Chinese and the Gulf states working together.
Excellent.
That's the play that takes place. The second story, very quickly, is that when the Americans went into the direct talks with the Russians over Ukraine, the Chinese foreign minister went to the Europeans and said, we think Europe should be involved in the talks. We think Europe should be there at the negotiating table. So it was the Chinese, not Donald Trump, that was trying to get the Europeans back into the discussions.
Incredible. You can call back now. I promise you, I couldn't. That you could see that was too much of an interesting, engaging conversation exchange. Right, I'm picking up your calls now. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, Titilokwe.
I thought it would be you, Titilokwe. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Professor, good evening, sir. Do you think that the relationship between Donald Trump and Putin now, very special one, is strategically targeting China by Trump? If Trump gets closer to Putin, automatically he will be able to check on the activities of BRICS. By so doing, he will be able to put his dollar and his interest as first priority. Then number two, sir, you see, with what is happening in Russia now, Russia is invading Ukraine, nothing is happening. At the end of the day, under Trump, Russia is going to be winning now. Do you think the same thing playing out in China versus Taiwan against the one China policy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, there you go.
Okay, so that's a great question.
Yeah,
and let me take it
especially
into two
Chinese,
parts.
The Chinese Taiwan.
The first thing is, though, on China, in terms of where the U.S. and Russia see China as they negotiate, I don't think Donald Trump, and I don't think many of Trump's advisors have an idea of China when they talk about how they deal with Ukraine. They're thinking about Trump's ego, right? So they're not gaming this out. And they're not gaming out, by the way, the effect on China and Taiwan, especially if Russia is allowed to keep part of Ukraine. I do think Russia is gaming this out, which is one of the problems for the Russians. I mean, when we say they're winning, they're not really winning. At best, they're able to hold on to what they have in Ukraine, but it's at high cost. And the problem for the Russians is they're under international sanctions and they're dependent on the Chinese right now to keep the economy ticking over. They don't want to be absolutely dependent on the Chinese. So what do they need? They need the U.S. to lift sanctions. So then they have more than one avenue for their economy to go with. Where's the Chinese stake on this? The Chinese stake on this is you can have a peaceful resolution regarding territorial disputes. But the fundamental of this, and you need to notice what the Chinese say, is we always have to pay attention to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, why would the Chinese emphasize Ukrainian sovereignty even though Russia occupies a quarter of the country, right? Why would they do that?
Yeah.
Because when China talks about sovereignty and territorial integrity, they are talking about their own sovereignty and territorial integrity, which in the Chinese conception includes Taiwan.
Yes, you can go back. I will pick. This is, Scott, honestly, next time you're coming, it's going to be 2 hours because this whole hegemonic discussion, it's long. You can go back now. I will pick up your call. Sorry, I couldn't pick it up then because we had, as you could see, I didn't want to interrupt the professor. Right. So let me come to you. So we have to talk about, I don't know whether to do Gaza first or let's do South Africa versus Trump. Yeah. Because we've touched on Gaza and Trump and the ludicrousity of that.
I'll link the two for you.
Please do. Right. Well, of course. We'll do both. We know what it is. But I'm going to let you do it. So Trump came out and of course with his, president in chief, Elon Musk, to say, South Africa, we're not playing with you anymore. You're doing bad, as he said, bad things are going on in South Africa. Bad things are going on in South Africa. South Africa is doing the land reforms, which has been decades overdue, They're currently doing it. And even then, it's still not going to balance things out. But at least you've got to start from somewhere. So you have all of that happening. The same South Africa that went to the ICC. Now, where's this going to end? Because the South Africans are not backing down. And I have to say, people like you and I and the rest of Africa were like, go South Africa, don't back down. Stand your ground. However hard it is, you have the money to look after all your people who have HIV. You have the money to do everything you need to do. You've been collecting US aid, that's fine, but you've only been doing it and been lazy. You can afford to stand without them. And that's what the South African people are also saying. Talk to us.
You answered it better than I could. I mean, what absolutely happened, you know, we know where Elon Musk is from. And by the way, when you hear the next thing about how Trump and Musk are going after the undocumented immigrants, guess who was an undocumented immigrant in the United States?
Elon Musk.
His career.
Yeah.
Elon Musk. Yeah. We know, about the views of Elon Musk's father, even though he's estranged from him.
Yeah.
We know that there are other people in the Trump camp who effectively, and let me just call them out for what they are white nationalists. Therefore, they have sympathy for the apartheid era whites in South Africa. So that's an easy thing to do, to go in, which Trump always does, and says, we're going to sanction you over how you've mistreated the white farmers without having any attention to what was actually happening with the land reforms. And as you absolutely mentioned, there were other advisors in the U.S. who said, we've got to get South Africa because they're in the lead on the ICJ case against Israel over genocide. Now, what you just highlighted, and I wish the international media picked up on this, is a key point. Because the question is, how do you deal with Trump, right? When a bully comes after you and threatens him, you punch him in the nose.
Absolutely. Right?
And South Africa went back and said, okay, sanctions. Let's see what you're going to do about that.
Do your worst.
They didn't make concession. And the other country that has done that effectively, the other country that said was Mexico.
Yeah.
Mexico has got a very tough leader named Claudia Sheinbaum, who, when Trump went in and said, we're going to sanction you, she said, yeah, right, whatever. And she said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. I'll send a few National Guard to the border, blah, 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 blah. And by the way, stop sending guns into Mexico. That doesn't help us.
It was brilliant. It was poetic.
Yeah. But the problem here is that now we bring it around to Gaza and why it's important to keep that ICJ case going. Gaza doesn't have anybody that can punch a bully back.
That's right.
I have no love for Hamas, by the way, in saying that. But Hamas is sharply reduced as a force. The Gazans themselves are just scrambling for their lives. You know the statistics.
Yeah.
You know how many killed, how many displaced. And the problem here is that you need somebody in the world who is going to be able to give the Gazans some type of future that takes place. And that's where we come back. We've talked a lot about the destruction that's been wielded. This is where, if we believe in an international, if we still believe in an international community, this is where this has to take place. So, for example, I'll give you a couple things. There has to be concerted action continuing within the United Nations, not just, you go to the Security Council, the U.S. will veto, we know that, blah, 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 not just General Assembly. You need to go to the UN agencies. For example, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, because the U.S. has cut funding to them.
Yeah.
And you need to say to other countries, don't cut funding, which is what Israel wants you to do. You need to go to other countries and say, even if only in principle, we need you to recognize the state of Palestine. We need that to be the marker of what we are aiming towards that takes place. And we need some type of planning internationally which says, look, what is a plan in which you are going to be able to help as an international community with reconstruction, right? And what are you going to be, and this is the interesting one for Africa, because it comes back to what you say about leaders. The big problem in Palestine right now is that Palestinian civil society has been absolutely ripped apart. It's been ripped apart by the Israelis. It's been ripped apart by Hamas. It's been ripped apart by the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians need to be able to have a government which is responsible to their own people, right? Now, how can people in Africa who have gone through that as well, when are we going to have governments responsible to their own people? When can they work with others? where we get to some type of idea which isn't just simply Hamas or no Hamas, which is, by the way, where we are and why we will not get a phase 2 of the why we won't get a phase 2 of the ceasefire.
So you don't think there's going to be a phase 2?
No, because I'm looking at the clock. We got a minute, right?
Yeah.
I'll tell you why. Okay. Phase 1 of the ceasefire almost didn't happen. It almost didn't happen because of hard right ministers in Israel. There are 2 of them. There's a finance minister named Smotrich. There's the former national security minister named Ben-Gvir. When pressure was put on Netanyahu to go to phase 1 in ceasefire to get some of the hostages back, those 2 ministers said, okay, we'll keep supporting the government, but not if there's a phase 2.
Yeah.
We want a military government in Gaza. We do not want Palestinians running Gaza. Okay?
But
so you put that up there. And then secondly, what phase 2 is supposed to do is it's supposed to have an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza plus a government for Palestine. Because the Israelis insist that Hamas not only cannot be part of the government, but should leave Gaza, you cannot get an agreement because Hamas is not going to agree to that. They're not going to go away.
Okay, so we had Dr. Bassem of Hamas here, I think it was last week, Bassem Naim, that's it. However, even since then, one of the things that's happened is that Hamas, was it yesterday or the day before, said, look, we will give all the hostages back, which is what Trump was saying, right? As long as in phase 2, you stick to phase 2 and you withdraw fully from Gaza. Now, given that Hamas has made that offer, which is what the Israeli society wants, obviously everybody wants the hostages back, right? Which is what the Israeli society. Do you think the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will still be able to say, look, no, we're not going to have the hostages back. We're going to go in and begin the fight. And if you go back, if Israel goes back to war now, there's a huge risk. There's a huge risk that Israel is even going to suffer more than the 5,000 plus casualties that they had before, because you've gone through a ceasefire, which means you've given Hamas the space to actually re-strategize, set booby traps, all sorts of things. I mean, we have a minute, right? Less than a minute.
Very quickly, Netanyahu is caught. You've played out right. Netanyahu is caught between the hard right and he's caught between the families who want their loved ones back, right? But here's the other 2 things why I think Netanyahu will not go into phase 2. At the end of the day, Netanyahu has said he wants Hamas destroyed. What your Hamas guest said is quite right. In phase 2, Hamas is not destroyed. Hamas is allowed to stay in Gaza. Whether or not it becomes part of the government, we can discuss. That's what he was restating. Netanyahu can't agree to that for his political future, which means he would face early elections and he would face going back on trial for bribery charges. Okay,
we're about to get cut off. Right? 1 second.
Donald Trump.
Yeah, go on.
Donald Trump's ethnic cleansing remark gave Netanyahu the space to side with the hard right, so there is no phase 2.
Excellent.
That's why the ethnic cleansing remark is important.
Scott, you've got to come back next week. I'm going to get my producer to be in touch with you. We'll book the time. It's always great fun, isn't it? Have a great weekend.
Hey, no fun from my table.
Y'all stay safe, stay sane.
Oh yeah, let's eat. Cook up unbreakable buns with Darren King.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.